Good afternoon. Thanks for joining us across the fence. I'm Fran Stoddard. Before the word pandemic became part of our everyday conversations, it's easy to forget we were living in an epidemic and still are today. Only a few years ago, there were 114 drug overdose deaths in Vermont involving opioids, according to the National Institute on Drug Abuse. For those in recovery, it's not enough to stay home, to stay safe. Across the Fence's Marco Ayala reached out to the executive director of the Turning Point Center of Chittenden County to ask how isolation and quarantine affects people in recovery from substance abuse.
There are thousands of Vermonters across the state that are struggling with alcohol and substance use disorders, including people with an opiate addiction at this point in time. We know here in the center, for example, about half of our guests have an alcohol dependence, and another half have an opiate addiction. So it's pretty pervasive throughout the state.
Right, and it's probably exacerbated with the circumstances that we're dealing right now with self-isolation, correct?
Well, the enemy of recovery by substance use disorder from an addiction is isolation. Here we are as a state, a nation, having to isolate to beat another enemy, and that's this terrible coronavirus. So it is probably the worst possible situation for someone who's suffering from an addiction. The antidote or the cure for addiction is community. I mean, and we can't do this alone, and yet here we are forced to be alone. So given that, we're doing everything we can in this recovery center and the other 11 across the state to try to create community without being together physically. So you'll find a number of phone conversations going on, a number of video Zoom meetings that are happening in the 12-step community and with our recovery coaches. We're, for example, open every day of the week for phone, email, and Zoom meetings from 9 to 5. Anyone can call here, and we would be able to offer them support or get them to where they could get that support. But isolation is a terrible thing for someone in recovery. It's so here we are, but we have to isolate in order to beat this coronavirus.
Correct. So, and you have already talked a little bit about, contacting Turning Point and having Zoom meetings and probably Skype as well as phone interviews. What else can people do in order to, keep on track on their recovery during this self-isolation period?
Well, I think the thing that people have to keep in mind is not to be worried. Geez, am I making too many phone calls? Am I overextending my need to have a conversation with someone? Do it, and we'll worry about the consequences down the road. I want people to just go through any anxiety they might be feeling about should I reach out and say, damn it, I'm going to reach out and I'm going to make that phone call, whether it's the Turning Point or if it's a sponsor or friend. But the last thing I want them to do is feel like, well, I don't want to bother somebody. We want you to bother somebody right now because that's critical for their recovery. And the other thing it's important to be aware of, Marco, is that many people with a substance use disorder and addiction also have co-occurring mental health issues, depression, anxiety, and those also require connecting in a meaningful way. And I know a lot of therapists, for example, around the state are going to a telemedicine format to make sure those appointments are being met. And I would encourage people to be in touch with their mental health clinician, prescriber, to make sure that they're continuing either to get their medicine or to meet with their therapist on a daily basis. We know that a lot of folks that have a substance use addiction also have had trauma in their life, and they need that kind of support, especially during a time when they're not able to make the physical connections that they normally would. So this is a time to really be assertive, really be your best friend, and do whatever you can to make connections.
Great.
Yeah.
And Gary, is there anything? How can family members help their loved ones, reach and stay in their recovery goals during this time?
That's a great question, Marco. And families can be an extremely important part of the solution during this time, for sure. Certainly, being in touch with their family member who has an addiction and is in recovery, or even if they're not in recovery, reaching out to them, and then offering an ear, offering support, and maybe encouraging them to make a call to a friend or a sponsor if they're in the 12-step community or this recovery center or any of the ones around the state. But it's a time for an extra level of effort to connect with that loved one. And there's many a story that I've heard where families have maybe distanced themselves for good reason with someone that has an addiction, and then encouraged to reconnect. That reconnection in many times has saved someone's life. So even if there's been some hard feelings, or even if there's been some bridges that have been burned, give that extra call right now and see what's going on and what they can do to be helpful.
Great. Well, anything else you would like to add, Gary?
No, that's it's a trying time, and it's going to be for a good stretch. My guess is so. Um, it's not one call; it's calls. It's not one connection; it's a bunch of connections. And I would just call on people's innovation and creativity during the time to connect in a way that's going to keep us moving forward in recovery and help people get to recovery that might not be there today. We just can't pull up our tent stakes. We should actually be planting them in the ground in a new way during this stretch of time.
Great. Thank you so much, Gary. Such an important topic for our region during these challenging times. So thank you for taking the time to share all this information with our Across the Fence viewers.
Oh, my pleasure, Marco. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Gary. And now back to the studio.
Thank you, Marco. To contact the Turning Point Center, call 802-861-3150 or visit the website turningpointcentervt.org and click on the tab for online recovery resources. Our next story takes a Vermont favorite and turns up the heat. Vermont maple sriracha brings the best of Thailand and Rutland together in one delicious sauce that's perfect for just about everything. Here's Keith Silva with our story.
Lower those down a foot.
Yeah. Jackson Whalen and his business partner, Lenny, Big Lenny Montori, run Vermont Maple Sriracha in Rutland. As the company's name states, it's a very Vermont take on the ubiquitous sauce.
Our hot sauce isn't that spicy by hot sauce standards. You're not going to regret it a day later if you have Vermont Maple Sriracha. And every bottle is unique because every harvest of peppers is different. So we might get a batch of jalapenos that's slightly hotter than the last one, but because we don't add anything like xanthan gum or any of these thickeners or water to it, we can't adjust the heat. So the heat is what it is. It's relatively consistent, but we've had batches at a certain point in the season where the peppers just happen to be hotter.
It took Whalen and Montori 7 tries before they got the recipe to their liking. It's personal preference that guides their business decisions, for better or for worse.
Everything we do here is how would we do it if we did it for ourselves. So when we first started making sriracha, we would buy these bushels of peppers. And after a pepper gets picked, the first thing that doesn't look good on it is the stem. It starts to dry out. So traditionally, if you're manufacturing hot sauce at scale, You clean everything, but you throw the stems in with it, you grind it up, it becomes part of the sauce. When we were making this, 10 gallons at a time on Lenny's stove, we cut every stem off because that's the way we wanted it, because we were going to eat it ourselves. So the same reason, that's why we kept the recipe simple, because we make it like we'd make it for ourselves. Now in terms of economics and profitability, that's kind of coming around to bite us, but we keep reminding ourselves that the reason that people like it so much is because we did take the time to cut the stems off. We did take the time to figure out how to make this natural sauce, preserve it naturally, and not put artificial ingredients into it. If it's not something we would do for ourselves, then we don't do it. So that's sort of the guiding principle of everything we make here.
The production of Vermont maple Sriracha has gone from being made on Big Lenny's stovetop to a nearby commercial kitchen. Here at the Vermont Farmers Food Center, west of downtown Rutland, Whalen and Montori have built a facility to process Sriracha-flavored cashews, what they call Sriracha shoes. Expansion was another decision that wasn't in the business plan or done by the book.
What business plan? I mean, it's really entrepreneurship by gut. Everything we've done here, we've been told was not possible and that we shouldn't try and do. So if we had paid attention to all the business books and business planning advice that we've gotten, you and I wouldn't be standing here and we wouldn't be making Sriracha shoes because we wouldn't have been able to take control over it. So we've kind of had to throw a lot of that out the window. And specialty food's a particularly brutal, low-margin business to begin with, so you have to have a little blind ambition,
At $10.99 a bottle, consumers have to show a little blind faith as well. Whalen says customers tell him it's worth every penny.
Yes, our hot sauce is expensive compared to other hot sauces produced at a giant, massive scale. But I think the people that appreciate it value what we put into it and are willing to keep supporting us. So we've been really encouraged that things have continued to grow. We haven't had any artificial spikes where we've crashed really hard. That's an excellent question. Why do we keep doing this? And it really is motivated by the response we get from the people who are eating it.
If there's one thing to say about Vermont maple Sriracha, it's not too hot, but it sure is getting hotter. In Rutland, I'm Keith Silva with Across the Fence.
That's our program for today. Thanks for joining us Across the Fence. I'm Fran Stoddard.